Good afternoon and good morning to those of you who may be in Hawaii. Aloha. We're starting this a little early so you can tune in, and please stay tuned. We'll start in about 5 minutes time. Thank you. Good day, everyone. This is Rodney Sobin at NASEO. We'll give it another couple of minutes as people tune in, and we'll start then. Thank you. Okay, it's about 2 minutes after the hour. Thank you very much for joining us at this webinar. My name is Rodney Sobin. I'm a Senior Program Director at NASEO. Welcome to today's webinar, which is being held under the banner of the NASEO NARUC GEB Working Group, where GEB is Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings. This working group is a partnership of NASEO with our partners at NARUC, supported by the Department of Energy. I do want to take a moment to recognize our NARUC friends and colleagues, including Danielle Sass-Burnett, who's been leading from the NARUC side our collaboration. I also want to thank my colleague Ed Carley at NASEO for supporting the development of this in our GEB activities. We are pleased today to host Julie Michals of E for the Future and Kate Strickland from the Smart Electric Power Alliance to speak on benefit cost analysis for grid interactive efficient buildings and other distributed energy resources. Before beginning, I do want to go over a little bit of logistics. All the attendees are muted. We do ask that you use the Q&A box to ask questions. It's a relatively modest size group, so I think there is a hand-raising feature. I'm relatively new to Zoom, but when we get to the Q&A section after the presentations, please feel free to use the Q&A box, and we'll see about raising hands as well. We do intend on making the recording and the slides available at the NASEO GEB Working Group site. Before beginning the presentation itself, I do want to say a few words about the GEB Working Group and the general topic for those who may be unfamiliar. As we all know, advancing technologies are opening opportunities for more flexible load management, to reduce costs, improve resilience, and to reduce emissions. There are some benefits that can improve grid services by reducing peaks and moderating ramp rates. All of our activity in this area is predicated on high levels of energy efficiency as well. And as we know, there are increasing amounts of various renewable resources coming online and distributed resources. And this grid interactive efficient buildings can be a way of making these more compatible. Our main questions are, how can we optimize interactions of these facilities and buildings with the grid? What are roles for states to fashion policies, programs, and rules to optimize with GEB? And what are roles for states and utilities, facility operators, and other stakeholders in making this happen? That had led to the development of the GEB Working Group, again with generous Department of Energy support. We are working with the states to inform and support states on this topic and to facilitate exchange. And I'm also pleased to say that we are partnered with the national laboratories in providing technical assistance to the states on a number of these particular topics. The working group is now up to 22 states. Our co-chairs, Casey Radcliffe from Oregon and Hannah Terwilliger of the Minnesota PUC staff. We thank them and we thank all the participants for all their wonderful work. I'm going to now make it available to Julie Michals as she gets her slides up. Let me introduce our speakers. Julie is Director of Valuation at E for the Future, where she has focused since 2016 on improving the valuation, reporting of energy efficiency and other DER impacts. She oversees the work of the National Energy Screening Project, including the National Standard Practice Manual, which you will hear about. Prior to E for the Future, she spent over a decade with the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships. Hold on a moment. And where she directed the Regional EM&V Forum, a multi-state regional platform focused on building common currency for evaluating and reporting energy efficiency impacts. She holds a bachelor's in business economics from UC Santa Barbara and a Master of Arts in energy and environmental analysis at Boston University. She will be accompanied and followed by Kate Strickland, who works as a research and industry strategy manager at SEPA with a focus on utility business models and regulatory innovation. In addition, she is a staff co-lead for SEPA's Energy Storage Working Group. Previously at SEPA, she worked with the 51st State Initiative, shaping the evolution of the utility sector. Prior to SEPA, she completed her master's degree from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in International Relations and Economics with a concentration in energy and energy resources and the environment. So let me hand it to Julie. Please go ahead.
All right, thank you, Rodney. Let's see if we can do this here. I'm going to share my screen. Hang on, last time this worked. Okay, I think let me go to slideshow from beginning. All right, I just want to make sure you're seeing the right screen.
Hey, Julie, this is Kate. We are actually seeing the back end with the notes.
Yeah, so we did this last time, and for some reason this time it is not. How about this time?
Yes, that's it. As we all learn about all these different platforms.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to a few of you also. Thank you, Rodney and Ed, for inviting me to speak today about the benefit cost analysis for GEBs and other distributed energy resources. I will be covering today information around the National Standard Practice Manual, followed by Kate diving a little bit deeper. And let me get my, oops, I'm sorry, going too fast. Let me share a little bit about this project. The NSPM was developed by the National Energy Screening Project. It's a stakeholder organization open to all interested parties who are looking to improve cost effectiveness screening practices for efficiency and other DERs. We've developed a couple products, the NSPM for energy efficiency a few years back, and more recently an NSPM for DERs. We also maintain a database of screening practices. This work is managed by E for the Future. We're a small nonprofit public charity, and in coordination with key partners and largely funded by E for the Future, as well as with some DOE funding. The NSPM for DERs was developed by a large consulting team on the left here. Many of those also developed the earlier version, and we work very closely with the list of partners on the right. Now, there's a mouthful for acronyms, and I don't expect you to be familiar with all of them, but essentially they are, a host of the regional efficiency organizations, ACEEE. I expect you are mostly familiar with Advanced Energy Economy, Building Performance Association, and a few others there that help us build understanding and awareness around this new publication. And there's a link there below. I believe you will get the slide deck to the large advisory group who helped inform this project. So our agenda today is to give you a bit of background on the NSPM for DRs. We're going to shoot a couple polls at you in a minute, though, to better assess your familiarity with this document. We will give you an overview of the benefit cost analysis framework provided in the NSPM. Kate's going to dive deeper into guidance, in particular around GEBs with an illustrative example. And then we want to leave you with just an overview of some things that are in development this year to help support NSPM application. I think this is where we ask familiarity with the polls, or is that coming up?
I can pop them up.
Maybe,
I was going
no,
off.
maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe that's my bad. Let me share a little bit here, and I think we have them numbered on the screen, so that's my bad. So here's just a bit about the NSPM, developed because of rapid increase, of course, focusing on integration of efficiency with other DERs and buildings. And so this was expanded. The scope of it applies to efficiency, demand response, distributed generation, storage, and electrification, including in buildings and electric vehicles. For those of you who might be familiar with the earlier version, there are some changes in terminology. We went from referring to a resource value framework and a resource value test to a NSPM BCA framework and a jurisdiction specific test, because it's exactly what the NSPM helps to do, is to create a jurisdiction specific test. The audience and uses for the NSPM is quite broad. It's any entities overseeing or guiding DER decisions, including PUC, state energy offices, those of you on the phone here representing those agencies, utilities, DER representatives, practitioners, consumer advocates, and so forth. And the purpose really is to help guide valuing these DER opportunities to inform policies and strategies. And it can be a host of things. It can be expanding existing plans and strategies to incorporate a broader set of DERs, to look at non-wire solutions in the context of procurements and evaluating, identifying value streams in that context, incorporating DERs into distribution system planning, and overall looking to see how these investments can help meet specific jurisdictional policy goals and objectives. And a few of them are identified here. So we are seeing a lot of interest around the country around this resource guidance document. And this just gives you a snapshot flavor of where we've actually had states apply the NSPM. And these three green states were applying the NSPM for EE principles and concepts in some capacity. We have a number of states actively or considering using the NSPM in yellow. And then the purple states and the shaded purple states are those where we're seeing a lot of current activity. And what's interesting now is that we have states looking at applying the NSPM in the context of not just efficiency, but broadly across all DERs, or focusing in on a particular DER, whether it's electric vehicles. There's interest in that application in development right now in Maryland, for example. There is interest in application in the context of non-wire solution dockets. We're seeing that in Colorado. Or, as I said, broadly across all DERs to help meet and address state broad clean energy statutes and policies objectives. All right, so there's that first poll question, and I'll turn it over to Ed to ask you how familiar you are with cost effectiveness testing, or BCA, of energy resource investments.
And so we have both poll questions.
And
showing.
yes, right. Followed by how familiar are you with the NSPM for DRs?
All right, looks like pretty much not quite everyone has had a chance to reply. We've got looks like a pretty good representative sample here. So Last chance on the second question. You may have to scroll down. That's going to be going once, going twice, going 3 times, and ending. So I'll share the results now. So it looks like 55% of attendees are somewhat familiar, 10% are not at all familiar, and 35% are very familiar with the cost effectiveness tests or benefit cost analysis. And then for poll question 2, 15% are very familiar with the NSPM for DERs, and 50% are somewhat familiar, and 35% are not at all familiar.
Okay. Well, good to see a large portion of you are quite familiar with the NSPM or somewhat. So, you know, we're not going to have a whole lot of time to go into depth today, but certainly we'll give you a flavor of what is in this document and focusing in on the GEBs application. So this is a overview of what is in the NSPM, the table of contents. And the important thing to take away here is it's organized into 4 parts, plus the appendices. It's quite long. It's close to or about 300 pages, so rather dense. But the important thing is that it's structured so that each part builds on the previous part. So as a user, we really wanted to make this user-friendly in that, you know, first we set out to lay out this BCA framework and how can a jurisdiction develop a primary test and the relevance of the usefulness of considering secondary tests. And then part 2 lays out the whole universe, if you will, of different DER benefits and costs and key cross-cutting issues to consider in BCA analysis. So that's kind of a lookup section of, well, what are the different benefits and costs and how are they defined? None of this is telling you what to include or not include. That part 2 is what you should be aware of in terms of the range of impacts to consider. Part 3 then spends time on each of the DERs to provide specific guidance on key considerations around BCA for these DERs and things like what types of factors might affect impacts and things like use cases and so forth. And we'll touch on that a bit today. And all of this information then builds up to actually, you know, application. And when you're doing a multi-DER analysis, such as multiple on-site DERs, Chapter 11, that's what Kate's going to get into, where we provide a GEB example. We have a chapter dedicated to non-wire solutions or alternatives. And then the Chapter 13 says, okay, well, what if you have to prioritize across DERs? You have this portfolio. How can you consider and look at results, BCA results, depending on what your priorities are. And then we touch on dynamic system planning. That's not an area of focus, but we touch on the relevance vis-a-vis the previous sections. And then a host of appendices to support application of the guidance. So let me touch on the BCA framework. Important to understand this, and I'm going to be speaking about this largely from the perspective of making, setting up a BCA framework and test for the purpose of analyzing utility investments in resources, but we will also touch on what that lens might look like if you're a state energy office, for example, looking to make decisions about investments of DRs in your buildings. So this framework has 3 components. There's a set of core principles. Those of you who are familiar with this, you will have seen some of this, so I will try to make this as brief as possible. But for the newbies, I think it's important to understand these core elements and these fundamental principles, as they really are the foundation of the NSPM guidance. We provide a multi-step process for developing a primary test, and then when and how to use secondary tests. And when I use the term process, the NSPM really does offer a process, and how we're seeing states use this framework is they start through a step-by-step process to develop their test. So they're not starting the process with a predefined test that they're looking at necessarily. They may have an existing test and they may choose to modify it, but they use the NSPM process to identify what modifications make sense vis-a-vis these principles and vis-a-vis the guidance. So these are these core 8 principles. We don't, I'm not going to go in depth in all of them, but I think some very important points to make here are the first principle being that, a consistent, treating DERs as a resource. Increasingly, many states are indeed doing that or have been. And then ensuring consistency in valuing these different resources using a consistent framework. This helps to reduce risk of either overinvesting in a resource or some combination of them. So think of it as a level playing field or apples to apples comparison by having that common framework. Additionally, a siloed approach to valuing DRs can make it more complex for regulators and state energy offices and all stakeholders involved. And of course, a common framework can also allow for better, like I said, comparison of prioritizing DER investments. The second principle, very important to align with applicable policy goals. The intent here is that for a jurisdiction to value resources, one needs to be clear about why are we investing in these resources in the first place and ensuring we've identified what those goals objectives are and that they are then accounted for in the BCA, in the cost effectiveness test. Importantly there, some policies are and objectives are dynamic, not static. And so there is a need to update those, your test periodically. So symmetry, very important also, and considered, sort of basic economically sound guidance. If the costs are accounted for, the benefits should be accounted for and vice versa. And this is one area that the NSPM really emphasizes in its application. The fourth principle here is just ensuring that if impact is relevant, whether it's a utility system impact or not a non-utility system impact, it should be accounted for even if it's hard to quantify. And we run into this challenge often and increasingly with different DERs, especially as we start considering how to account for certain utility impacts as well as host customer impacts. And then I'll just skip over long-term forward-looking analysis. That's just making sure we're not accounting for sunk costs, avoiding double counting in certain areas. We provide guidance and examples there. Transparency is critical, and the NSPM process allows for that. And lastly, conducting a BCA should be done separately from a rate impact analysis. And that's increasingly important as we're looking to valuing certain DERs, especially EVs, especially distributed generation, where there's a tendency to account for, looking at revenues as benefits and making sure that we're really separating that analysis of a rate impact analysis, which answers different questions than we do from a BCA analysis. Examples of goals. This is just a snapshot. Many of you would be familiar with these. There are common overarching goals, largely that from a utility perspective, the safe, reliable, low cost, protecting low income customers and so forth. Resource goals, often articulated by statute, sometimes in IRPs or other plans and regulatory decisions, and other applicable goals. And these might be largely related to societal type goals. And they're expanding, right? We now see an increased focus on equity and ensuring environmental justice and these types of important goals. So the primary test, what question does it answer? It answers which resource have benefits that exceed costs and therefore merit acquisition or some level of support. And that is fundamentally different from something like a rate impact analysis, which focuses more on questions around equity, not so much focusing on benefits and costs of a resource, but equity across customers, and hence the delineation Furthermore, just to consider here, secondary tests may be useful to complement a primary test if a jurisdiction is looking to address situations where there might be, for example, marginally cost-effective resources or inconsistent policies across different DER types that need to be addressed and looked at with a different lens, or understanding the implications of achieving certain policy goals, as well as prioritizing investments in DERs. And what the NSPM here in this illustration brings is what's referred to as a regulatory perspective. It's really sort of the decision maker perspective, in that on the left side, we see what are traditional perspectives used in cost effectiveness analysis, largely coming from a publication known as the California Standard Practice Manual. Many of you may be quite familiar with the manual, and the generally prevailing tests referred to as the societal cost test, the utility cost test, and the total resource cost test. On the left side, we see that central to those tests are accounting for utility system impacts. And then depending on what perspective, you have these rings with the relevant impacts that broaden the perspective to the broadest test being the societal perspective. On the right side, the NSPM for DRs introduces this different perspective, which basically says your jurisdiction is your jurisdiction, and you should be accounting for, beyond utility system impacts, those applicable policy goals and objectives that are articulated in your jurisdiction. And that's why that line is not a firm, hard line. It is unique, and it is your jurisdiction's perspective, and therefore your jurisdiction's test. That does not mean it may not align with one of the traditional tests. That's quite possible, but it may not. And so that level of flexibility provided by the NSPM is what differentiates it from the traditional way that we've done cost effectiveness. Now, a note here on, a state energy office perspective in a situation, for example, as I mentioned earlier, where let's say a building manager is managing, a number of buildings and is looking to invest in grid interactive, GEBs to improve the operations of its buildings. And what are the relevant costs and benefits? Well, this is where, a bit of a departure from the NSPM, because the NSPM does focus on the investments in, by utilities using public funds to acquire resources. One might, one can still use the NSPM to identify the whole range of occupant or host customer impacts. And that approach is what's generally been, referred to is using a participant cost test and bringing the participant perspective to that analysis. So the same way the utility sort of starts with a utility cost test, a participant view would start with the participant cost test. Sometimes those are used as a secondary test by utilities, but if this is the situation we're looking at, that could be a good starting point. And it helps to address issues and helps decide how is money best spent. It accounts for things like reducing bills and accounting for non-energy impacts. And you can use the NSPM to look at, well, what are the range of those non-energy impacts that I should be considering? And wait, should I also be considering additional societal impacts, because I ought to be aligned with the policies of my state or my jurisdiction? And so if I have climate, greenhouse gas emission reduction goals or public health goals or economic development goals, all, articulated in statute around the, clean energy goals and the like, then maybe those should be accounted for in my analysis as well, and my contribution to that. Okay, moving along here, I'm just going to run through the next few slides to give you a flavor of what type of information you'll find in the NSPM. So again, here is just more detail. On the left side, you have the utility system impacts examples. And again, this is if the BCA involves utility investment. And on the right side are the host customer impacts and societal impacts. And these are not exhaustive. There may be things that are, and in fact, I have a slide ahead that I borrowed from LBL that has some additional host customer impacts that aren't listed here, but it's meant to give you a flavor. And further, when we think about GEBs and we think about demand flexibility, remember that those value streams are embedded within these different, whether they're utility system impacts or host customer impacts. And I'll give you a better example of that in a minute here. So here are the host customer impacts, and they're broken in down into more detail, breaking out even further the non-energy impacts and the types of things that certainly have been valued and accounted for in the context of energy efficiency. And increasingly, we're seeing, interest in how do we account for these types of non-energy impacts in the context of other DRs as well. So moving on to key factors that affect DR impacts, I mentioned that we have a section, part 3, that focuses on the different DER category types. And in each of these, we look at, well, what are the things that affect BCA for different DRs? And I'm not going to read through all of these, but they should be pretty obvious. And in fact, Kate's going to go into more detail on some of these examples. The NSPM further gives a flavor of, well, these factors, will affect whether something is a net cost benefit or it depends. And that hence you have this color coding examples. This is looking at utility system impacts for the different DERs, where red is typically a cost, green is typically a benefit, and orange or yellow is, well, it depends. And you have to understand what use case you're looking at. What are the different factors that might affect what the magnitude of an impact, cost, or benefit will be. Similarly for host customer impacts, as well as for societal impacts. And so this table I mentioned earlier, this is borrowed from LBL. I think it's a great slide. And so maybe you have seen this based on some of the recent work and reports that they've issued, focusing on demand flexibility. But here you have the two columns of where does demand flexibility, that value, lie within avoided costs from the perspective of the utility system, or from the perspective of a building owner occupant. And there you see some examples of what those energy and non-energy benefits might be to the owner occupant. So that's something to keep in mind. And I will just say that identifying where those impacts live is one thing, actually quantifying them is another whole challenge, as we know. So I mentioned, there are factors that affect impacts, and they affect, valuing demand flexibility. And there's no single value for demand flexibility, because it is going to depend on certain factors. And some of those have everything to do with things like the timing, temporal impacts, the location, the type of grid services provided, the expected service life of the measure, and then of course the avoided cost of the least expensive alternative. And then, the value, very important that the valuation methods and practices that we develop for these account for these types of variations. So we're going to ask you a quick poll question before I turn it, a couple of them before I turn it over to Kate. And don't sweat over this. You're going to see a long list of things to choose from. I think you need to scroll down because we have the two questions together on this page. But we'd love to get a sense from you on, based on your work, where are you seeing the biggest challenges in quantifying some of these impacts, both on the utility system and non-utility system side?
You know what? It looks like I might have only made it a single choice. Let me end this real quick, fix that setting, and relaunch the poll.
Okay, Ed, I see both. Okay, go ahead. I think I saw both. That's okay.
It may be that I am unable to edit it. I think that I can't tell if
You issued the first, second one. So why don't you close that one? And try again the third and fourth, Ed, because I think it looked okay from my end. Maybe we can get a thumbs up from the audience if they could see both of them.
my concern is more that they are not, they may not be able to vote for more than one choice.
Oh, okay.
I may have cut and paste in that it says multiple choice. I'm not sure. If someone in the chat wants to test it and let us know, that would be helpful.
Well, the alternative is I invite folks to just put in the chat, what do you think are? Let's just look here at this list for utility system impacts. And, you know, we just want to get a flavor of what are you struggling with? And if you even want to be more specific, that's great.
So we're hearing that question 3, the multiple choice seems to work, but someone's having a problem with question 4 on only being able to do one. So pardon the technical issues, but let's, I would suggest we just move ahead and use the question 3, and question 4 works. I do see some multiples and go by that. And others say they are able to submit on both. But anyway, we'll proceed. Sorry about that. All these different platforms, clicking on different things in different places, depending on which one. Sorry about that.
All right, so I've got 10 of 24 votes. I'll give it another, say, 10 seconds. All right, going once, going twice, and we're gonna close it out with 12 total votes. So I'll share those results. So everyone can see those.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. And no surprise that risk and reliability and of course resilience is the clear winner. And I'm just scrolling down to the second part, non-energy benefits and societal equity. Yes. Okay. That pretty much aligns with, you know, what we have been thinking ourselves. So thank you for that feedback. That's very helpful. And feel free to add anything more in the chat box, and we can always bring stuff up for any questions when we're done here. But with that, I'm going to go to the next slide here, and Kate is going to share with us some guidance on BCA for GEBs. Kate, are you with us?
I am. Hello, Julie. Hello, working group. Thank you, Rod and Ed, for having us today. And as Julie said, Kate Strickland with SEPA, and I will be providing a high-level overview of benefit cost analysis for GEBs, as well as an illustrative case study. As Julie mentioned, Chapter 11, entitled Multiple On-Site DERs, includes benefit cost analysis guidance for GEBs, in addition to other items such as microgrids and smart communities and neighborhoods. And of course, benefit cost analysis for GEBs or multiple on-site DERs certainly depends on the type of DERs deployed. So the size, the operating profile, the existing on-site resources and portfolio. So this is where Julie mentioning that the NSPM builds from the single DER chapters to the multiple DER chapters is really important, because you can go into those single DER chapters and sort of dive deeper into those particular DERs. But today I wanted to highlight some of the key factors impacting benefit cost analysis for GEBs. And as you can see here, wanted to focus and highlight on integration and cross-coordination of program design. We can think about this from a GEB perspective in terms of existing programs and resources on site. So if there is the ability to leverage incremental benefits from existing resources, this will likely reduce upfront investment costs, and you could see an increase in annual cost savings from a benefit cost analysis perspective. And this dynamic is certainly at play when we think about retrofitting buildings to become more grid efficient and interactive. Additionally, a key factor here is determining all host customer impacts, as Julie mentioned. And of course, this also depends on the DER operating characteristics at play, but we can think about how in the GEB context, older and more complex buildings could certainly result in higher building operating costs. Or also think about how building loads and the different use cases of the DERs within a grid interactive efficient building or buildings are going to have different impacts to host customer benefits and costs. And then finally, I wanted to highlight existing infrastructure investments and visibility and control. And this is really getting at some of the factors around data availability and granularity of data, and how using data to establish avoided cost profiles and measure program impacts, of course, are key as we think about a GEB context. Next slide, Julie, please. So additionally, as Julie mentioned, there are key challenges impacting benefit cost analysis for GEBs. As I mentioned previously, the types of DERs deployed and their capabilities, the specific locational and temporal impacts at play. For instance, to highlight here, if we think about a GEB providing demand flexibility, that ability to adjust loads and provide local capacity savings could certainly result in locational benefits being higher. Or the temporal value and impacts at play have significant impacts for GEBs. And I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into this with our illustrative GEB case study example. And additionally, on the locational and temporal impacts front, I wanted to highlight some of the guidance within the NSPM about how the guidance is that we should be estimating locational and temporal impacts with enough detail to adequately represent the DER operating patterns and then the consequent benefits and costs. And additionally, an additional challenge is interactive effects between DERs, which Julie, if you want to go to the next slide. I wanted to highlight the major types of interactive effects here. As you can see, we will discuss it a little bit more with the illustrative GEB case study. So setting the stage here. And three major types of interactive effects at play. We have the impact on marginal system costs. So this is the idea where significant penetrations of DERs in one area could potentially impact and affect avoided costs of other DERs in the same area. And this impact is relatively small for GEBs unless you have high deployment. An additional type of interactive effects is energy and capacity. And so this is one DER affecting the kilowatt hours or kilowatt impacts of other DERs. We're going to explore this a little bit more in the illustrative case study as well. And this is particularly important for GEBs. Finally, we have enabling effects where one DER makes it easier or more cost-effective to adopt another DER. So a classic example of this might be combined solar and storage. And this is also certainly important to factor into GEB program design. And we'll explore this a little bit more in the illustrative case study as well. Next slide, Julie, please. So getting to the illustrative case study. So we included this case study within the NSPM in order to really demonstrate key factors and challenges, including interactive effects, and to dive a little deeper in terms of analysis. So a note that this is illustrative, however, based on typical experience and data. And so our use case here is a commercial GEB. Our DER types are behind the meter energy efficiency, demand response, distributed PV, and distributed storage. And as Julie referenced earlier, this hypothetical jurisdiction has a jurisdiction-specific test that includes utility system impacts, host customer impacts, and also greenhouse gas impacts, because that particularly is a jurisdictional priority. Key assumptions at play here for our case study are assuming that the utility program is leveraging the commercial GEB to provide demand flexibility and to integrate clean resources, excuse me, during system peak hours to meet that jurisdictional greenhouse gas emissions reduction goal. Moving on to the next slide, please. Here we have in figure 11.3 an example of GEB cost effectiveness. And per the jurisdiction specific test, figure 11.3 is including utility system costs and benefits, host customer costs and benefits, and greenhouse gas impacts. In order to illustrate the net impacts at play in cost effectiveness. And here we're seeing on the right overall net benefits, but I'm actually going to walk us through this in terms of understanding what exactly is at play. Thanks, Julie. So here on the left, table 11.1, we have the net benefits and costs for the utility system impacts for the GEB case study. On the right, we have the same cost effectiveness table. I'm just highlighting the utility system impacts, both the benefits and costs within the red box to better explain what's going on here. And so specifically, to start with that green bar on the left, we are seeing significant energy generation and capacity benefits in this case study due to the GEB's demand flexibility. So the GEB is shifting building load away from system peak hours, and that load shifting is also providing capacity during system peak hours. Additionally, we're seeing excess solar from PV being used to charge the GEB's storage system during off-peak hours. And then the storage systems are discharging during system peak hours. Finally, the GEB is using demand response direct load control to shift load during system peak hours to off-peak. Next, in terms of transmission, which is that blue bar, we're seeing transmission benefits accrue due to the GEB's combined DERs reducing delivery of central generation to customers. So for instance, the distributed PV is helping meet on-site customer load. And then the orange bar distribution is also showing net benefits for distribution impacts accruing. We're also seeing in the general section on the left, benefits from reliability, resilience, and risk. However, they're outweighed by some of those other more general utility costs, such as financial incentives, and program administration costs. So here we're seeing an overall general utility cost in this particular example. Next slide, Julie. Additionally, here on the left, we have both the host customer impacts and societal impacts, as well as the cost effectiveness graph on the right. And so per Julie's earlier point about the importance of the symmetry principle, here you can see that this example jurisdiction and case study is including both host customer costs and benefits, the yellow bars, to ensure symmetry in the treatment of impacts in the jurisdictional specific test. Additionally, the blue section, the greenhouse gas reduction benefits, are accruing as the GEB helps offset resources with higher marginal greenhouse gas emission rates. And so within this case study, by including utility system impacts, host customer impacts, and selected societal impacts per a jurisdiction's priorities, we are illustrating a net benefit in terms of cost effectiveness. Next slide, Julie, please. Additionally, we also wanted to highlight that common challenge I referenced earlier around interactive effects. And so here in table 11.4, we are considering major interactive effects, specifically enabling effects between pairs of DERs. So that includes distributed, demand response and energy efficiency, and distributed PV and storage. And on the left-hand side of the graph here, you can see the DER's benefits without accounting for interactive effects. On the right side of the graph in the blue bar, you can see the total benefits from accounting for interactive effects within the GEB. And because we are accounting for interactive effects, we are seeing an increase in benefits. And it is important to note, however, that interactive effects can enhance or reduce benefits depending on the particular pairing. And so here you can see with distributed PV and storage that the storage is improving the PV benefits through the ability to utilize that excess generation during low electricity cost or demand periods, and then discharge during high, electricity cost or demand periods. Conversely, and in this particular case, we're showing that energy efficiency measures are somewhat reducing some of the demand flexibility capacity available to respond to events within the GEB. And that brings me to the end of some of our illustrative case studies for GEBs. However, we're going to move on and share a bit more information about the NSPM projects to come in 2021.
Thank you, Kate. So the reason we're going to jump, and then we're going to definitely have some time for Q&A, we want to share with you some projects that are just launching this month, in fact, to support application and use of the NSPM. And one of them has to do with taking these examples, case studies from the NSPM that Kate just shared with you, and to develop more robust and what we're referring to as, real world case studies. And we want to share more information on that with you, as I think it will be useful for this working group. And we also would like to invite some of your input at this time. So here's just an overview of some of the things that we have planned for this year around the NESP work, the National Energy Screening Project. Of course, we have general state outreach and providing state technical assistance in quite a few states. We're working now in Minnesota and Washington, DC, and in the near future, potentially in the state of Washington, among others, where we provide input to processes that are looking to apply the NSPM or are actively undergoing one. We are launching an effort to create a document library of sorts on methods for quantifying impact. It's referred to as the methods, tools, and techniques for quantifying impacts, both utility system side and non-utility system side. Synapse Energy Economics is leading that work, and with some others, to develop a library that you all can use to go readily find existing information on ways and options to quantify different impacts. We are moving to next year, deferring to next year, some work on developing a complementary BCA formula catalog for the NSPM. And we are also aiming to launch an online training effort. Again, something we had hoped to get off the ground this year, but more likely next year. And if you haven't already seen our database of screening practices, this is an online tool that we have on the NASP website. My colleague Shayna Fiddler manages this effort, and it basically documents all the cost effectiveness practices and links to the relevant policies and resources for different states around energy efficiency. And lastly, but not least, is this work on the BCA case studies. And I'm going to hand it back to Kate because SEPA is leading this work along with ICF to develop these case studies.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks, Rodney and company, for letting us go just a few minutes over our time. Much appreciated. So I will make this high level. As Julie mentioned, really excited to expand on the NSPM case studies with a new set of more detailed analysis. And the project objective, which is running this year, will aim to be completed by December, is to identify illustrative benefit cost analysis of leading DER use cases to develop three additional case studies. And we are going to be informed by real world use cases, but generalized into more detailed illustrative examples that really demonstrate the application of the NSPM BCA framework and how DER use cases drive DER assessment. And Julie, if you want to move to the next slide. Wanted to highlight, the use case parameters that we are currently envisioning for the case studies. Certainly based on and informed by existing regionally diverse projects and publicly available data. Goal is a mix of single and multiple DER types, including a focus on energy efficiency and demand response. Certainly, case studies could include commercial and residential applications, as well as a low income focus. And then really, a goal is to identify core examples of utility system and non-utility impacts with varied key factors. And on the right of the screen, you can see some of the potential DER use case examples that are currently on our list, both single DERs, distributed generation, energy storage, electric vehicles, as well as multi-DERs. So solar plus storage, bring your own device, GEBs, as well as non-wire solutions. And where we would really welcome your input with the next slide and the next poll is feedback on which benefit cost analysis use cases would be most valuable for your work. I recognize this is the GEB working group. However, certainly that is a priority use case for us, and interested in your feedback as well about additional use cases that you would find most valuable. So Ed, I'm hoping that we'll be able to move forward with the poll. Thank you.
All right, it should be up now.
Thank you.
While everyone's filling this out, I also wanted to note that there's an additional use case here focused on building electrification as well that we're interested to hear your feedback on. And if you have more thoughts than a multiple choice poll can accommodate, please feel free to type ideas into the chat box as well.
So we are at 12 of 19 responses. I'm going to give it 5 more seconds, I think. So going once, going twice, and we're going to close the poll. And the results.
Excellent. All right, it seems like we're seeing some agreement or slightly more agreement with solar plus storage, but also seeing a lot of different answers here. So this is really valuable. Thank you for providing your feedback. And the next last interactive item we have is moving on to the next slide. Given that this is the GEB working group, if there are real world projects and examples that you would like us to be sure to highlight in our research and evaluation, please feel free to put them in the chat box, or certainly open to connecting offline to discuss further as well. And next slide, finally, my last item. Thank you to Rodney and Ed for promotion efforts around this. Wanted to mention a complementary effort that is currently ongoing at SEPA, which some of you may have heard about. SEPA is doing an integrated energy efficiency and demand flexibility study. This study is being conducted in partnership with LBL as well as DOE's Building Technology Office. And the project scope, separate from NSPM but complementary, is focused on how utility integrated energy efficiency and demand flexibility programs can promote GEBs. And we're focused on investigating successful projects, key learnings, existing business model challenges and regulatory barriers, and also some focus studies on utility programs and program design. We're currently convening experts for focus groups and interviews, and my contact information is included in the deck if anyone would like to discuss this study further. And Julie, that brings me to the end of my slides.
Thank you, Kate. So turning it back to Rodney and Ed.
Thank you so much. That we're a bit beyond the hour, but I think that's okay because we had a very rich set of materials here. Thank you very much, Julie and Kate. I do want to take a few moments for some questions that came through, and also encourage those who are sticking around, if they have questions, to please offer them or raise your hand. The first question is, some of the costs and benefits are really hard to quantify. You know, things like environmental impact, occupant comfort, resilience. People are arguing how to quantify resilience all the time. Do you have any advice on how to handle those things? Are there ways to have sort of include semi-quantification where you have high, medium, low on a 1 to 5 scale, those sorts of things?
So what the NSPM provides, there's an appendix, I believe it might be Appendix C, that provides some guidance on methods for quantifying for hard to quantify impacts. And the reality being, as this question asks, is that in some cases, there is not readily available information, or perhaps one jurisdiction has done a study, but that information, that those results really are not transferable to another jurisdiction. And certainly we've seen, and I'm sure some of you may be familiar with practice in some states around efficiency to account for certain impacts by using some level of a proxy variable, such as a percentage adder. And we've seen those range between for a single impact, between 5 to 15%. We've seen some jurisdictions sort of lump everything together with one large percentage adder. The reality being that some jurisdictions just don't have the means or appetite to do primary research to quantify these impacts, but they recognize the value isn't zero. And so there's some effort to recognize that there are these value streams. I think that we're starting to see a lot of that practice has been around host customer non-energy benefits. I don't know quite how jurisdictions are yet accounting for increased resilience. For example, there has been some information. I think there was a NARUC publication just a year ago that looked at that from the context primarily of solar. But certainly there are efforts to study that impact more. And again, there might be sensitivity analysis, as Rodney, you just said, low, medium, high, that may be valuable, and also may help inform primary, secondary testing. And again, where secondary tests place a higher value on those impacts or lower value just for comparative purposes. But in the meantime, we hope that the effort we're undertaking this year to create this library on methods for quantifying these different impacts that will be able to point users to the latest information, and we'll be updating that as more research and studies are conducted.
Thank you, Julie. I do want to slip in one more and thank those who are still sticking with us over time. This one is, what guidance does the NSPM provide if there are conflicting or different policies for various DERs for developing a consistent primary cost-effective test?
So essentially, that is something that we have not yet come across in a state application, but there is some guidance provided there because it may well come up where a jurisdiction indeed has different policies and directives and language, whether it's in statute or decisions around what the value streams are for particular resources. And the NSPM essentially says that a jurisdiction has the option to go to determine whether there's a broad or narrow interpretation of those policies. And I think that this is where the NSPM application can help walk states through the considerations they need to make along the way as they develop a primary test. It can help create transparency in how that determination was made by interpretation of policies. And in reality, it may require discussion with stakeholders and feedback from different stakeholders on appropriate interpretation and application. And it will be up at the end of the day to the decision makers to determine what makes the most sense and what is more appropriate.
Okay, great. One more has come in, and I think that's because some of our folks are not immersed in the Public Utility Commission world, but they're mention of primary and secondary tests. Why do people do secondary tests? What is the purpose of that? Why not just do one test and that's it?
In jurisdictions, they do only use a primary test. As I did mention sort of early on, I didn't have a slide dedicated to it, but it may be the case where certain DERs are marginally cost effective. And unless you have a policy that says invest in all cost effective DERs, there's likely budget constraints that the decisions have to be made on what do you invest in. And if something is marginally cost effective, you know, what your secondary test may help inform whether to invest in or not those, you know, by looking at different value streams for those marginal and cost-effective resources, for example, and help prioritize the portfolio of investments.
Okay, great. So we are quite a bit over time, but it was a very good discussion. Thank you so much. We appreciate this. And we will be posting the slides and the recording at the NASEO NARUC GEB Working Group website. So thank you all to the attendees. Appreciate your interest, and please don't hesitate to let us know if you want to reach out on the working group, and also for any suggestions for future webinars, and also to take up Kate on her request for cases that might be useful for their study, as well as useful for the working group to share information. So thank you all. Have a good afternoon, and for the Hawaiians, I believe there were some. Thank you. Have a good morning as well. So take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rodney.
Thank you. Bye-bye.